The Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any matter or measure or adopting any amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. I would like to remind members that we've established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating amendments, exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our markup today. Excuse me. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as possible. I would also ask members, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. Before I call up the first bill, I recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for a point of personal privilege.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this moment of deep and continuing sadness of the loss of one of our beloved staff persons, Greg Berry. Larger than life, so many people have known him, been with me for more than a decade. Chief counsel, but I'd like to call him our chief guru, the guider of our office, the protector of democracy, the lover of equality, and the lover of justice. He was a worldly man. He traveled from the West Coast to the East Coast, graduating from the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, receiving his BA from the University of Washington, and then Master's in Political Science from Michigan, a PhD candidate at Michigan, but then finding his way to the United States Department of Energy, United States House of Representatives, and was a professor of constitutional law at Howard University Law School, School of Law. But all of those academic accolades, which I pride myself in recognizing such talent, really did not speak to him as the quintessential teacher. He would teach anyone, including the member. And it was good and best that you learned from him. He taught our interns, he taught our staff, he taught friends of staff of other members, and all I can say is that a bright light has gone. He loved this place. He loved this, as his family spoke to me yesterday. He said that he had reached his ultimate goal to be here, and he loved this place. We loved him, and we loved the contributions that he made, and that his long-lasting contributions, again, Mr. Chairman, to all of you, is that no matter what your affiliation was politically, he had a sense of respect for this institution, you, Mr. Chairman, and the Judiciary Committee's work as an iconic framer of the Constitution and its survival. So my tribute to Greg Berry is that his spirit will continue to move around in this room where he was most happy, and that we will continue to fight for democracy and the upholding of the Constitution in his name. I'm grateful for you to allow me this moment to say thank you to Greg Berry and to all of my colleagues and staff who was so kind to share your thoughts with us. We hope to get his funeral arrangements soon for all to know. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman, and I offer my condolences to her and to all of Greg's family and friends on their tragic loss. He served Ms. Jackson Lee and this institution with great distinction, and we're all deeply saddened by his passing. May his memory be a blessing. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 350, to authorize dedicated domestic terrorism offices within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice. Without
objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. With consideration of H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2022, the Judiciary Committee is taking reasonable, meaningful steps to to address the rising menace of organized intolerance and hate-fueled violence. This bill creates 3 offices, one each within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the FBI, to monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. These newly created offices would issue joint biannual reports to Congress assessing the state of domestic terrorism threats with a specific focus on white supremacists. H.R. 350 requires these newly created offices to focus their resources based on the data collected and the most significant threats, which will be described in detail in their joint reports to Congress. These are reasonable, measured policies to help focus the federal government's resources on the threats that continue to terrorize and kill Americans. In April 2020, the committee held a hearing titled Hate Crimes and the Rise of White Nationalism. Last February, the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security held a hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America. And last month, the Crime Subcommittee held a hearing on the rise in violence against minority institutions. We have been forced to return to the subject of domestic terrorism year after year as our communities repeatedly face the grim reality that we must do more to combat white supremacy and domestic violent extremism. Recent white supremacist attacks have reminded minority communities across the country of a dark history we have not yet escaped. The 2019 shooting spree at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, which left 22 people dead and 24 more wounded, marked the deadliest attack in modern times against the Latino community in the United States. The El Paso attack was also the 3rd deadliest act of violence by a domestic terrorist in more than 50 years. Sadly, many of these attacks have targeted houses of worship. In 2012, a white supremacist entered a Sikh temple in Milwaukee and murdered 6 people. 3 years later, 9 worshipers were murdered by a white supremacist at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. And in 2018, 11 congregants in Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue were gunned down in the middle of Sabbath services. Following these tragedies, the committee heard from numerous experts and community leaders who described the continued threat posed by white nationalism and the continued need to do more to keep Americans safe. It was clear last year that there was a need to address this threat, which is why we passed this legislation in the House with bipartisan support. Unfortunately, it languished in the Senate. Since then, racial, ethnic, and religious minorities have continued to face intimidation and violence. Recent attacks include the murder of 6 people of Asian descent at spas in Atlanta last summer, 5 Jewish Americans being held hostage in their Texas synagogue, and numerous bomb threats across several historically black colleges and universities during Black History Month. The Department of Justice has an array of statutory authorities to bring charges against domestic terrorists, including those who are white supremacists, but it is abundantly clear that the department has not initiated a sufficient number of these prosecutions. This legislation would give DOJ the tools it needs to monitor, identify, and prosecute domestic terrorism cases, along with the data it needs to focus on the greatest threats. In January, the department announced a new unit to combat domestic terrorism. While I hope this unit proves to be effective, there are additional steps Congress can and must take to protect Americans from domestic violent extremists. H.R. 350 takes the proactive step of creating offices within DOJ and DHS to pool resources from all parts of each department to focus them on the greatest domestic terror threat, white supremacy. To ensure that law enforcement across the country has the tools it needs to stand against this threat, H.R. 350 also establishes the Domestic Terrorism Executive Committee, which must meet at least 4 times per year to coordinate with U.S. attorneys and other public safety officials to promote information sharing and ensure an effective, responsive, and organized joint effort to combat domestic terrorism. It also directs the FBI to assign a special agent or hate crimes liaison to each FBI field office to investigate hate crime incidents with a nexus to domestic terrorism. Every part of the country deserves responsive, well-trained law enforcement officers to protect all Americans from white supremacist violence. The bill therefore requires DOJ and DHS to review the training each department provides to state and local law enforcement to ensure that their programs include training and resources to assist law enforcement agencies in understanding, detecting, deterring, and investigating acts of domestic terrorism and violent white supremacy. One thought before I close. This legislation is a bipartisan solution to a serious and documented problem facing our country. We have certainly had our differences in this hearing room when it comes to how Congress should address domestic terrorism and white nationalism. But each one of us must acknowledge that the threat of violence from these extremists is real. I therefore urge my colleagues to address this legislation in the bipartisan, practical spirit in which it is intended. As I said, this very same bill passed the House overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis 2 years ago. Put another way, we are trying to provide our federal law enforcement agencies with the resources they need to tackle an imminent danger to our constituents. Please do not disrupt this work with sound bites and conspiracy theories. I thank Representative Brad Schneider and Senator Dick Durbin for their diligent work in developing and introducing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act here in the House and in the Senate. This committee stood together last Congress to pass this legislation in a bipartisan fashion. I urge all members to do so once again to protect the nation from the threat of domestic terrorism and to keep our communities safe. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last fall, September 29th, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to the Biden White House asking the Biden administration to treat parents as terrorists. Let me just read from that letter, because sometimes I think we forget the language that was enclosed in that letter, September 29th, 2021. Here's what the language says, and this is not a soundbite or a conspiracy theory. This is what they wrote to the Biden White House. The National School Boards Association requests a joint expedited review. The National School Board Association requests that such review examine enforceable actions under the Patriot Act, asking the Biden administration to use the Patriot Act against moms and dads. 5 days later, the Attorney General of the United States sends a memorandum to the director of the FBI. Here's what the memorandum said. I am directing the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working with each United States attorney to convene meetings with federal, local, and territorial leaders within 30 days of the issuance of this memorandum, and to open up dedicated lines of communication for threat reporting, to open up a snitch line on moms and dads. 16 days after that, October 20th, because of a brave whistleblower, we learned that the FBI sent out this email to agents around the country. As a result of Mr. Garland's memo, the Counterterrorism and Criminal Divisions created a threat tag. Again, I'm quoting here from the email. We ask that your offices apply the threat tag to investigations and assessments of threats. All that happens in 22 days. A letter from the School Board Association, a memorandum from the Attorney General, and then an email sent out to FBI agents around the country to put a threat tag, this designation, this label on moms and dads. 22 days. First thing I always say is I've never, in my time in Congress, never seen the federal government move that fast. Never. 22 days. A couple things we've learned since then. First is between the initial letter on the 29th and the memorandum on the 4th, we learned that Viola Garcia, the individual who signed the letter to the Biden administration from the School Board Association, was given a plum job, a plum assignment at the Department of Education. And second, and maybe most importantly, we learned that the National School Boards Association didn't really initiate this whole thing. The Biden administration went to them. Emails that we've now seen show the Department of Education first went to the School Board Association and said, write the letter to us, give us the pretext so we can do what we want to do, namely go after parents. So it was a plot, it was a scheme, it was a plan, started first with the administration, not with the School Boards Association. And then, of course, we have October 21st. October 21st, the day that the Attorney General came in front of this committee and made this statement. I could not imagine any circumstance where parents are treated as domestic terrorists. Only problem with that statement is the very day before, the email had went out to FBI agents around the country saying treat parents as domestic terrorists, put this threat tag label on them. And now here we are today. Here we are today with the bill that's going to codify, in effect, what took place that the chairman refuses to actually have any more hearings on, something that is, I think, front and center of the folks I talked to in the 4th Congressional District. But here's what the legislation would do that's in front of us today. The legislation would codify and authorize domestic terrorism offices within the Office of Intelligence and Analysis of DHS, the Counterterrorism Section of the National Security Division, and the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI. So they're going to actually, this bill is going to put in place what these guys attempted to do and did last fall. I think this is definitely the wrong direction to go. I would hope, Mr. Chairman, that at some point we could have the Attorney General come back and talk to us about, we got a little taste of this last week in the Crime Subcommittee, where we got to talk to the U.S. Attorney from the state of Washington and found out he did, in fact, convene that meeting. We tried to ask him some questions about it, didn't really give us any answers. It'd be nice if the Attorney General would be back in front of us to deal with this subject. But I think this legislation is the wrong way to go. I hope that we do not pass it. Urge a no vote and would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. I would simply point out to the gentleman that the National School Board Association apologized for that letter within days of its issuance, and
That's sort of proving my point, I think. That's how wrong it was.
well, they made a mistake and they apologized for it. Nobody's taken any action on the basis of it.
The person who hasn't taken action is the Attorney General of the United States has not rescinded the memo and the action that he put in place. That's what's warranted. That's why we need him back here to answer the questions, things he said in that committee hearing that turned out not to be accurate, and we need him to rescind the memo and stop what's ever gone into place. And the last thing we need to do is to pass this bill, which is going to codify the whole plot and plan and scheme they initiated last fall.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 350, offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all that follows after the enacting clause.
Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I now recognize myself to explain the amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes various technical and conforming changes to the underlying bill. For example, the amendment adds a requirement that the Domestic Terrorism Office and the National Security Division of DOJ must coordinate with the Civil Rights Division on domestic terrorism matters that may also constitute hate crimes. It also adds a provision to ensure that the report does not include personally identifiable information not otherwise releasable to the public. In addition, the amendment includes changes requested by the Department of Justice to improve the administrability of the legislation, such as narrowing the scope of certain review processes and allowing agencies to produce one report to satisfy multiple reporting requirements. Finally, the ANS enhances the training provisions to ensure that our federal prosecutors nationwide are equipped to prosecute domestic terrorism. All of these changes improve an already good bill, and I urge all members to support the amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Cohen seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate your bringing this bill, and I'm a proud sponsor, and I certainly hope we do pass it. Domestic terrorism is a problem in this country. It's a problem now, particularly with white nationalists and white supremacists. It's been a problem in the past sometimes with Weatherman and some other groups that were conducting activities that were on the borderline of First Amendment, just as some of these issues might be, but they went beyond it and they went to terrorism. We should join together and not be partisan and not be picking on the Attorney General for some past problem or the President, but joining together and being opposed to domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism is why the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, and lots of lives were lost in Oklahoma City because of a white nationalist domestic terrorist. We've seen these problems other places. It's a serious problem in America now. The situations are despicable and deplorable, and it threatens every public official. What happened at the school boards where people were challenged by parents, yes, they were parents. Parents are nice things, but not all parents are good. And when they threaten school board members with violence, saying, "We know where you live," that's wrong. Elected officials should have some safety between them and violence from people that are upset. My colleagues on the other side have seen it important to protect election officials and they should be protected. And so should school board members, and so should members of Congress who are coming under constant barrages and threats, maybe on both sides, and on both sides it's wrong. I wish we could get beyond the partisan bickering, at least on domestic terrorism, where people's lives are at risk and sometimes taken. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Shabbat seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This legislation expands government and bureaucracy, creating 3 new offices at the Department of Homeland Security, Justice, and the FBI to supposedly monitor and investigate and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. Well, in case the majority isn't aware, the federal government specifically, these agencies already monitors and prosecutes instances of domestic terrorism. They work often in conjunction with each other to prevent instances of domestic terrorism before they occur, to keep the citizens of this country safe, and that's what they ought to be doing. The more concerning issue with this legislation is, as the ranking member mentioned, with the Attorney General's October 4th memorandum, which labeled parents involved in their children's education as domestic terrorists. Now, I'm a former school teacher myself, and interacted with the kids and their parents on a regular basis. I taught the 7th and 8th grade in an inner city school. It was a long time ago, admittedly, but I don't think parents have changed all that much. And it's the parents who cared about their kids' education. The kids tended to do better and paid more attention, actually did their homework. The parents were involved. It's the parents that are absent and this is fortunately, for the most part, the minority of parents who don't pay the attention that they ought to their kids' education, where the kids really suffer. So we ought to encourage parents to be involved in their kids' education as much as possible. And admittedly, school board meetings can be impassioned. They can be highly emotional. They can even sometimes be unruly behavior that occurs there. As we all know, that is certainly possible. And when that happens, yes, the police can be involved in a very small minority of cases when it actually requires law enforcement. But the thing that it riled up an awful lot of parents in this country, for good reason, I think, was the policies which occurred in some communities across the country, for example, where the schools just wouldn't reopen. And yes, we did need to fight COVID, and we need to take it serious, and an awful lot of Americans lost their lives as a result of that. But we know that there were some school boards that went way overboard in keeping those schools closed and the kids out of the best education, which is in the classroom. And we're seeing the results of that now across the country here, where especially those in disadvantaged communities, the kids are having a heck of a time in reading and math and you name it. And the social skills, when you have the youngest kids wearing masks all the time, and that was another thing that happened. Is yes, early on we needed to learn about this and who needed to be masked, but some communities insisted on keeping those kids masked far beyond what common sense would say. So there were a lot of parents, for a lot of reasons, that were riled up. And yes, the teaching of critical race theory, which didn't happen in every school, but it was happening in some schools, and the parents were concerned about that. When you're essentially saying that there's 2 categories of people and telling the kids you're in one or the other, you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, the parents don't like that. They didn't want to have that in their schools, and they had a right to speak out about that. So we know, we all saw this happen, that parents were targeted as domestic terrorism. And the Attorney General was involved with that, with the letter that was sent out, and the last thing we ought to be doing is targeting parents as domestic terrorists. And so this legislation is so unnecessary. And I would argue if, and I condemn white supremacy and terrorism of any sort as much as humanly possible. But this legislation essentially ignores threats from the left. groups like Antifa, these anarchist groups who actually took over portions of cities only a couple of summers back. And the chairman said that Antifa was a myth. They're not a myth. They're out there doing all kinds of harm to this country, and this particular legislation doesn't consider them at all. So this legislation is unnecessary, and if you want to bring in all these terrorist groups on the left and the right, and you want to do something about them, I think our side would be willing to listen, but this is political legislation that never should come before this prestigious committee. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes, the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, let me thank Congressman Snyder for this legislation. Very proud to be, pleased and proud to be an active co-sponsor of this bipartisan Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. Let me just call the roll. Let me take a moment to just call the roll on the very essence of this legislation and the vital necessity. The shooting spree in my state at Walmart in El Paso, Texas, which left 22 dead and 24 injured. This individual drove 11 hours, as my friend and colleague, Congressman Escobar, indicated, to just kill Latinos, kill them dead. The rampage at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, where 11 people were killed, Jewish synagogue. The racist attack on the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, which left 6 people dead. The brutal murder of innocent worshipers at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, the funerals that I went to, who simply invited a terrorist into their church to pray. 3 Muslim college students executed in Chapel Hill, supposedly over a parking, but tinged with hostility for the young people's look. And the spa shooter in Atlanta, which we are honored today, who killed 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. He was moved to go and kill Asians. Charlottesville, where those with tiki torches were walking around talking about Jews and black people, that they should not be here. The terror of my beloved young people on the nation's historically black colleges, still frightened today about the potential of bomb threats. The skin I live in and have to be exposed every day to the potential of some comment or some action because of something I cannot change, my heritage and the color of my skin, or others who speak different languages, who live in different lifestyles. This is a disturbing increase, and white supremacy is at the front of it. The violence is without question. The proliferation of hate groups in communities across America is without question, and they exist rampantly online. Last year, the Subcommittee on Terrorism held a hearing, The Rise of Domestic Terrorism in America, to discuss the continuing surge of white supremacy and right-wing extremism, to discuss federal law enforcement's failure to address domestic terrorism and acts of violence driven by racially motivated hates and animus toward religious minorities. Despite our efforts, it continued. On January 15th, a gunman stormed into a synagogue, this time in Colleyville, Texas, taking 4 people hostage, but looking for them to free an incarcerated person who was claimed to be in the United States for terrorist reasons. The rise in violence against minority institutions, as I indicated, FBI Director Wray declared that 2019 was the deadliest year for domestic extremism since Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which I was in the United States Congress for, and saw that violence and terror, with 5 separate domestic violent extremist attacks resulting in 32 deaths in 2019, 24 of which were conducted by racially motivated extremists. In 2020, the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting recorded 8,263 hate crime incidents, 11,129. And of these incidents, 62% were motivated by racial or ethnic bias, 20% by bias against persons' sexual orientation, and 13% were motivated by the victim's religion. Let me just say this. I am a parent. These are not the parents that we were discussing. The idea of General Garland's effort was not to malign or attack parents or to make them unsafe or board members to make them unsafe. It was to ensure that the demonizing that was occurring over the pandemic's decision leadership to try and protect our children and misguided information was given to individuals, albeit innocent that they were, who came and screamed and shouted and said, "I have guns in my home, I will bring them to kill you." That is what General Garland was concerned about. Murder and pillage in school board meetings out of the words of parents, albeit misguided, albeit on wrong information. I take that. The memo has harmed no one. A gun could harm someone of someone misguided. This legislation is long overdue. Its focus is not our parents. Love them as we do. Its focus is to stop the surge, the absolute dastardly acts of white supremacy and the violence that is generated from it. How long do we need to explain this? This is an important initiative. Mr. Chairman, I ask all of our colleagues to support this and get back on track for what this nation stands for as we stand and fight with Ukraine as it fights against hatefulness and violence. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purposes Mr. Gates seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, if you didn't like critical race theory in your corporate training, if you didn't like critical race theory in your kids' schools, this is critical race theory with a gun and a badge and the power to arrest. And if my colleagues on the left are so worried about domestic terrorism, maybe they ought to be establishing new authorities at the FBI and DOJ to look into the BLM riots of 2020. Maybe they ought to have new authorities to go after Antifa and leftist agitators. But no. It's about white supremacy today. My concern is increasingly about the terrorists who are in our country who are crossing the border illegally. I was just in Yuma, Arizona with my colleague, Mr. Biggs, and we were briefed by Customs and Border Patrol about the known terrorists who are crossing our border each and every week, each and every month. And the majority here is more concerned about chasing the ghosts of white supremacy than dealing with those real and actual threats. The Attorney General in the United States came to this committee, misled us about the authorities that were being used to target American parents, and instead of giving the Attorney General an invitation to come back and explain himself, clarify, give us comfort that that's not occurring, we're giving the Department of Justice more authorities to continue the corrupt work that we see that they've already been engaged in. This bill grows government. It gives more authorities to a corrupt, weaponized, politicized Department of Justice and FBI, and it gaslights the targeting of white people. This is particularly problematic in our military. I would note that this legislation has a grave and negative impact on every single American wearing the uniform right now in our military. It has them all concerned that if they liked the wrong meme, shared the wrong joke 7 years ago, that their career could be ruined, that their patriotism could be tarnished. I get these concerns from my district most frequently from the units that are minority units. Because in our military, we try to train everyone to believe that you go through the same systems. You develop the same sense of common purpose. And now when we sick the FBI on the DOD and on our military to try to smear them as domestic terrorists or white supremacists, it erodes unit cohesion. It negatively impacts readiness. I have noticed that the parliamentarian referred this legislation not only to our committee, but to the Armed Services Committee as well. And I would implore the leadership of the Armed Services Committee, do not grant this bill a waiver. It has a significant impact on the readiness of our fighting force, and if this bill is not favorably referred out of the Armed Services Committee, it should not go to the floor. It must be given hearings there to see its full and damaging effect. Increasingly, the left wants to use federal law enforcement to target Americans. We saw that in the Russia hoax. We see that in the ongoing FISA abuses that the committee will not bring forward. We saw it with the targeting of parents who attended school board meetings, and now they're drawing a bead on our military. I thought about amending this bill to include requirements that BLM and Antifa and leftist agitators also be analyzed. But honestly, I'm not going to offer that amendment because I sincerely believe that the gravest threat to our country is the inward turning of exquisite national security authorities that we intended for terrorists in faraway lands against our own people. And my friends, now you are in power, and so you are trying to weaponize these institutions against those who you consider to be antithetical to your worldview. But keep in mind, that may sound good today when the FBI and DOJ are left-leaning, but they used to be right-leaning. The FBI used to essentially be a white supremacist institution. They targeted Martin Luther King Jr. They targeted Marcus Garvey. They targeted Malcolm X with some of these very authorities. And so I would just caution you against giving the power to an entity to ruin lives and to weaponize the apparatus of government with concepts that we never intended to be used on our soil. And if we do that, I think we'll have a more just system for everyone. We categorically reject white supremacy. It has no role in our country and our lives. But it's almost like we're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, because when we go accuse every American of being a white supremacist, I think then we lose the ability to accurately target the acts of violence that you've correctly identified and that our existing laws could deal with. I yield back.
Well done.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes does Ms. Ross seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'd like to express my full support for this bill, which addresses the critical threat facing our nation, a rise of domestic terrorism. While the issue of domestic terrorism is not new in the United States, we've recently seen an alarming increase in acts of extremist violence. In particular, the terrifying attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The events of January 6th constituted an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power, an assault on our fellow Americans, and an overt harm democratically elected public servants, and a rebuke of our nation's most fundamental values. Memories of the violence, chaos, and fear incited on January 6th will linger in these halls for years to come. Unfortunately, the events of January 6th mirror a moment in history in my home state of North Carolina, the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. Like the January 6th insurrection, the Wilmington insurrection was carried out by white supremacists intent on overthrowing a duly elected government. These domestic terrorists destroyed businesses, killed residents, and eventually succeeded in forcing Wilmington's government to step down. Our country should not be facing the same type of domestic terrorism today that we faced in 1898. It is long past time for us to recognize that some of the greatest threats to our nation come from within our borders, from dangerous ideologies that spur violence and hate. In the past few months, these ideologies have taken another form. At least a dozen historically Black colleges and universities across the country, and some in North Carolina, have received bomb threats. While no bombs have been discovered following any of the recent threats, they forced the cancellation of classes, the evacuation of entire campuses, the disrupting of students' ability to learn and feel safe in their schools. In addition to HBCUs, synagogues in my district and throughout the country have received threats of violence over the past few years, as have churches. These threats have forced the cancellation of religious classes, programming, and shaken faith leaders and their congregants in my district and throughout the country. Unfortunately, acts or threats of domestic terrorism can no longer be considered rare occurrences. It is now more important than ever that we pass legislation to strengthen efforts to prevent, report on, respond to, and investigate acts of domestic terrorism. I support this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, to the points that several have made on this side of the aisle, including Mr. Gates, I was intrigued. As was pointed out by some, this bill is passed and previously on a voice vote on the floor, meaning that nobody called for a roll call, nobody's terribly upset about it. To the extent you talk about domestic terrorism, white supremacy, there's been unanimity in Congress in opposition to that. But the problem is, and the reason the parents going to school board meetings and being the subject of the Attorney General's memorandum calling for meetings all over the country of federal law enforcement with other community leaders to sort of target them, and the threat tagging and so forth, the reason that gets called up is it begs the question, what is the motivation of this? And I was listening to my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Jackson Lee, she gave a roll call, as she said, but she didn't mention Waukesha, Wisconsin. Why not? She didn't mention when she talked about Colleyville, that was the one where she'd been talking about white supremacy, but she didn't mention the motivation of that one. That wasn't about white supremacy. It was an Islamic terrorist. The focus, the reason for the focus eludes me. So I looked at the chairman's memo to the committee, and you have, here it is, it's hate crime and domestic terrorism statistics. It says since there's been a 30% increase in 2019 in incidents motivated by race, ethnicity, or ancestry. Interesting thing to me is that reminded me of another statistic. There's been a 30% increase in homicides in 2020 across the country. This also says that since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots, completed attacks, and 91 fatalities. That's over 7 years. Just under half were in connection with those involved white supremacy. That would suggest about 45. Well, just in that year of increase in homicides, 5,000 more people were killed. How is this the priority? How is this the one that justifies reorganizing the FBI? And in order to do it, you redefine effectively what domestic terrorism is. Domestic terrorism is in a statute along with international terrorism. The only difference is international terrorism is that which occurs abroad, usually injuring Americans somehow, or that which transcends boundaries. Domestic is just the results happen in the United States. Well, you strip away all of that for the purpose of doing this reporting, except for those that are committed by people that are citizens or domiciled in the United States. Who are you targeting? And then later on of course, mention's been made of the January 6th riot at the Capitol. You have two things here. You're back to vilifying police officers. If you want to look for a cause of why we had a 30% increase in homicides, 5,000 more homicides across the country, probably because the Democratic Party made it its mission to defund the police and to characterize and to vilify police. And here you're doing it again, talking about white supremacy in the military, based on, as I read it, a handful of 10 or 20, or I don't even came to say it was that many. In one case, a Marine, it's like one person. And then you also vilify law enforcement. You're citing somebody's article that talks about the epidemic of white supremacy in law enforcement. My goodness. Have you learned nothing since undertaking the stupidest political activism in the history of the world to attack and defund police? Murders go through the roof, 5,000 more murders. But where is your priority? The priority is to codify. In fact, what are you doing here? You're codifying practices apparently the FBI is already undertaking. But I suggest that the activities the FBI has undertaken ought to be cause for concern. We haven't seen, there's been absolutely a total nonchalance from the majority about the Attorney General's memo. The chairman just said in the opening remarks in response to Mr. Jordan that it's no big deal. The National School Boards Association apologized for its letter. Indeed it did. But the Attorney General has not withdrawn his memorandum directing federal law enforcement across the country to focus on parents. We had the U.S. Attorney from Washington in here just a week or so ago in the crime committee, and we asked him, did you have any incidents in Washington that justified this? Nope, didn't know of any. that warranted a nationwide scope of action. That disturbs the majority not at all, and they want to double down on directing the power of federal law enforcement against American citizens. It should be of grave concern to all of us. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes does the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to once again talk about the scourge of domestic violence and domestic terrorism, and to take action. I am really stunned to listen to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle who are either delusional or willfully blind when it comes to what has become a cancer in our country. The cancer of domestic terrorism, white supremacy, the rise of racism and hate. And I'd like to express my gratitude to you, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleague, Representative Jackson Lee, for mentioning what happened to my community on August 3rd of 2019, when a white supremacist, a domestic terrorist, walked into a Walmart on a busy, beautiful Saturday morning and walked in with his AK-47 and shot indiscriminately into the crowd. Just yesterday, I was on the House floor speaking on a bill to honor the 23 people who were killed and the 22 who were injured in that domestic terrorism attack. And it is incredible to me that this cannot be a bipartisan unifier. We have talked about in this committee guns. And I will tell you, my community was at the intersection on that day of August 3rd, the intersection of our country's addiction to guns and our country's this cancer of hate and racism. You know, we have to come to terms with the fact that there is a radicalization of millions of Americans that is happening every single day. There are media outlets that are vehicles for that radicalization. There are members of Congress who are vehicles for that radicalization. And there are people all across this country who are vehicles for that radicalization. And we are not seeing less violence as that radicalization advances. We are not seeing less violence as easy access to guns happens. We are seeing more. And so we've got to take action. This bill is an important step. It is a common sense step in the direction of finally creating safer communities. We've seen what our Republican colleagues want to do. They want to ignore the rise of domestic terrorism, and they want to make guns more easily accessible. That's a toxic, deadly cocktail. It's a failure of policy, and communities like mine have unfortunately paid the price. It's time to stop these tragedies. It's time to acknowledge the truth that is in front of us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I support this legislation and I look forward to advancing it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Tiffany seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In spite of that radicalization, I still do not believe MSNBC should be taken off the air that they're doing to the American people. Let's be real clear about the apology in regards to the National School Boards Association. Why did they do that? They took the fall. They took the fall, and that's why the Attorney General should come back in and answer the questions that my colleagues have stated quite eloquently here, why Attorney General Garland should get back here. The School Boards Association just took the fall for what was happening within the Biden administration, and in particular with the Attorney General's office. The gentlelady from Texas did her roll call, and I'd like to build on some of the comments that Representative Bishop made. She did this roll call. She did not include the Bernie Sanders supporter that came and shot up some of our colleagues just a few years ago, almost killing the whip that serves here on the Republican side of the dais. And we can do this tit for tat stuff. I mean, we can just keep doing it back and forth and whatever. But that doesn't solve what the American people want to see happen. They want to see murders go down in the United States of America. They want to see violent crime go down in the United States of America, regardless of what their ethnicity is, regardless of what their color is. They want to see crime reduced. But that's not what we're dealing with today. And I just hark back to, 2 weeks ago, when we had the President's State of the Union. He said, we're going to fund the police. Well, for all of you out there in America right now, it's very clear that that was simply lip service, because the people that are driving the train at this point on the other side of the aisle, they have no interest in additional funding for police. They have no interest in supporting law enforcement, and you can tell by their priorities with having a bill like this come before us today. And I want to know why we're not having a hearing on what woke prosecutors are doing across America, because as much as we talk about, our governor recently announced there's going to be a big grant for law enforcement or whatever, but he didn't do anything about the prosecutors, which, by the way, he could relieve them for not doing their jobs, like the prosecutor in Milwaukee County. I will repeat to you, back in 2007, when he started his job as the district attorney in Milwaukee County, he said publicly, yep, we may divert some people that should perhaps be behind bars, and they may kill somebody. You bet, guaranteed, that's going to happen, but that does not invalidate the approach. Does not invalidate the approach that he took that ended up with 5 deaths at a Christmas parade in Waukesha County, Wisconsin. Why aren't we having a hearing on prosecutors? Why don't we bring the Attorney General in and have him talk about prosecutors that are not prosecuting crime, that is leading to a diminishment in the way of life for the people here in the United States? I would just close by saying this. I look up at that staff, that shield that is right in front of us here.
Sometimes so much.
I look at that shield that's up there that says E pluribus unum. And what is this hearing about today on this bill? It's about dividing people. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. I hope this committee will get back to trying to bring the American people together rather than dividing us. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing up this really important piece of legislation, bipartisan legislation for markup today. I must confess, my head is hurting a little bit because I'm trying to understand how an effort to stop violent domestic terrorism in my country is a divisive issue, and how we're again talking about school boards and critical race theory. But I'm going to do my best to bring us back to actually the subject at hand. There is no question about it. Domestic terrorism is on the rise. In fact, a recent analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies showed that domestic terrorism in 2020 was at its highest level since information started being collected almost 3 decades ago. This impacts the safety and security of every American, and especially minorities. It's important to remember that 2/3 of domestic terrorist plots were linked to alt-right extremists or white supremacy groups. 2/3. And according to Michael McGarry, the Assistant Director of the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI in 2019, and I quote, racially motivated violent extremists are responsible for the majority of lethal attacks and fatalities perpetrated by domestic terrorists since 2000, end quote. So this seems like something we ought to be addressing as members of Congress, and that's exactly what this bill does. These terrorists, often linked to white supremacist groups, have begun to massively organize and even infiltrate some of our law enforcement agencies and the armed forces. And domestic terrorists pose a threat to police officers here in the Capitol and all across this country. We've seen what these statistics look like in real life. Across the country, we've witnessed massive increases in violence and terrorism against minorities, bomb threats at HBCUs and Jewish synagogues, and shootings targeting Black churches, synagogue, Asian American establishments, and a Sikh temple, and a devastating attack on communities like El Paso. Congress and our law enforcement agencies need to act. And today we need to start by passing this bipartisan bill, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, to create offices at the DOJ, the FBI, and the DHS to monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. This bill would also improve and streamline information sharing and training systems between different law enforcement agencies, including at the local and state level, to better our understanding of and response to incidents of domestic terrorism and white supremacy. Finally, it would establish an interagency task force to combat white supremacist infiltration in our military and federal law enforcement, something I hope everyone can agree is important. We've passed this legislation out of this committee in previous Congresses, and we must do it again today. And to listen to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, again, attempt to take this very serious issue, which has brought incredible suffering and even death to so many Americans, and families have experienced tremendous loss as a result of these violent domestic terrorists, and to refuse to address this issue and instead to hijack this hearing to talk about other politically advantageous claims about critical race theory and school boards and Merrick Garland is profoundly disrespectful to the communities and victims of this horrendous violence. And frankly, this notion of again trying to use this as an opportunity to make the false claim that Democrats don't support police is really, really disappointing. So let me say it again. We had an opportunity not just to use a slogan about funding the police, but to actually show who supports and funds police in this country. And so we included $350 billion that we made explicitly available to local police to deal with issues of rising crime in the American Rescue Plan. It may surprise some of my Republican colleagues, but I'll remind them again, every single one of them, including every member of this committee, voted against funding the police in the American Rescue Plan. Every single Democrat, save one, voted to fund the police and provide $350 billion to help police address issues of increasing crime. So, it's a little rich to claim you're for funding the police and to claim the other folks are, and the facts are exactly the opposite. But what's most disappointing is even when everyone was reminded of their individual votes by Mr. Liu in the last hearing, you continue to make this claim rather than addressing this very serious issue of domestic violent extremism and white supremacy in our country, which this bill does. Instead of even working on this issue, you use it as an opportunity to yet again make the false claim that Democrats don't support the police and you do. It's shameful. You've tried it for 4 hearings. You try to hijack every hearing up. Support this bill and show once and for all you are for supporting our police and ending domestic terrorism in America. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Just strike the last word, Mr. Chairman. So the
Gentleman is recognized.
previous speaker just talked about we're trying to hijack the hearing and why do we focus on school boards? Because it's so darn important. Never forget, when the Attorney General sat in front of this committee, the very first sentence in his memorandum, we asked him about this. We said, here's what his memorandum says. In recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff. We asked him, what was the evidence for you making the very first sentence in your memo? What was the evidence for that? What did he say? He said the School Board Association letter. The letter that they've now apologized for and regret ever having sent it. And here's what that letter said. Sometimes you gotta look at the facts. You gotta look at what they said. The National School Board Association requests a joint expedited review by the Departments of Justice, Education, and Homeland Security. Interesting, 2 of those agencies are in this legislation, along with appropriate training, coordination, investigation, enforcement mechanisms from the FBI, including any technical assistance necessary from state and local coordination with its national security branch and counterterrorism division. That's what this bill does. Exactly what the School Boards Association asked to be done is what this legislation does, and it was this letter that the Attorney General used as the basis for his memorandum, which they've apologized for and said this wasn't accurate. Here's what this letter said too. It talked about four acts of violence they cite in this letter. One of them was the Loudoun County situation, which our colleague Mr. Roy has talked about, which was justified, frankly. Those were in 14,000 school boards around the country, and one of them was one where the parent was justifiably upset, right, Mr. Roy? So that's why we're focusing on this, and all we're asking is for the Attorney General of the United States to rescind that memo, take it back. And we're asking the chairman to have him come in and testify and answer some questions we have, and frankly, a lot of parents around the country have, because we now know there's a threat tag associated with some parents' names across the country. That's what this is about. This is about the facts. So the very document that they've apologized for, the letter that started this thing, this whole process, that they've apologized for and taken back, that language is exactly what this bill does. Somehow that's hijacking a hearing. I think that's doing what the people that I represent want me to do. So the gentleman from Florida, his comments were right on target earlier. This is not just about giving more authority to the Justice Department to go after parents. This is doing exactly what the School Board Association asked them to do. That's why we don't want to vote for this thing. That's why this is wrong. And I hope this thing doesn't pass. Would yield to the
Gentleman, yield for a question.
Yield to the gentleman from North Carolina.
And the School Board Association letter itself invoked the terminology domestic terrorism, didn't it?
Sure did.
So doesn't that beg the question? What is it that the majority means when they're talking about domestic terrorism and turning the power of federal law enforcement against domestic terrorism? Do they mean school parents of school children, or do they mean something else? I yield back to the gentleman.
I think a great point, and even more specific, they referenced the Patriot Act. In fact, I would ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record former Chairman Sensenbrenner's piece in the Wall Street Journal, where he says the Patriot Act was never intended to go after moms and dads, never intended to go after, it was for dealing with foreign terrorists trying to do harm to our country. I would ask unanimous consent that be entered into the record. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Correa seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, just last week, we had a bomb threat at one of our local high schools. I can assure you that both the Republican and Democratic parents, as well as the rest of our community, for a few hours there, were caught in a moment of fear, panic, terror. All of us feared. We feared for the health of our children, lives of our children. And we all prayed. We prayed that our local police officers would be able to do their job, to protect our children, and to make sure there was no harm would come to them. These stories are just all too common in nowadays. Some of them have good outcomes and some of them do not. For that reason, I want to thank our chairman today, our leadership in this committee, for marking up H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism and Prevention Act. And I'm proud to say I'm a co-sponsor of this bipartisan piece of legislation to authorize investigation into the threats of domestic violence. Since 9/11, the focus of this nation has been foreign terrorism, as it should be, as it should have been. But in doing so, for a long time, we ignored the obvious, which was the growing threat and the growing loss of lives resulting from domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism now accounts for more lives lost than foreign terrorism. And we're talking American lives being lost to domestic terrorism. Today, we start at the beginning. We start with the facts. We start researching this issue and making sure we put the resources in place to stop any threats, any violence due to domestic terrorism. I want to thank the authors for this measure, and I hope my colleagues here fully support this measure that will protect and save American lives. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes Mr. McClintock seek recognition?
To speak on the bill.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think the problem comes down to this. A few weeks ago, we saw Canadian truckers, including many Sikh immigrants, who were protesting civil rights violations involving vaccine mandates. The left called them white supremacists. American parents concerned about curriculum that teaches their children that skin color is the defining characteristic, including one African-American father I saw interviewed who said, "I don't want my children taught to hate their classmates based on their race." These protests were called white supremacists. Asian families in San Francisco protesting racial quotas, called white supremacists. Citizens concerned with voter fraud, routinely called white supremacists. It's clear that the left defines anyone who challenges their agenda as white supremacists and domestic terrorists. So giving more power to use the Justice Department that is armed with the most terrifying powers that any government possesses, the powers to stalk and threaten and intimidate Americans based on their beliefs, that is very concerning. And it's potentially dangerous to our most cherished and fundamental rights as Americans, our freedom to express our opinions freely and petition our government for redress of grievances. It is true that there is a lunatic fringe, and often a violent lunatic fringe, on every political side that can pose a threat to civil order. And we have very good laws to hold them accountable when their words become deeds and those deeds harm others. But it's actions for which free societies hold people accountable by law. Not opinions, no matter how outrageous those opinions might be. Not words, no matter how hateful or hurtful those words might be. Actions, deeds. But this doesn't target actions. It targets opinions and words. Indeed, not even opinions currently held or words spoken, but rather words that might be spoken, opinions that might be held, might be. If you can define words and thoughts as actionable with the vast powers of government, you have just rendered useless the freedom that is enshrined and protected by our First Amendment. I sit here listening to these discussions wondering whatever happened to that fundamental American ethic that we all shared, conservatives and liberals alike. I might disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. I think liberals, true liberals and conservatives still share those beliefs. But the left does not share that belief in any way, shape, or form. And we've seen that demonstrated over and over again recently in rampant censorship being leveled against Americans, in the unequal administration of justice, in the turning of our most powerful institutions against American citizens who are simply seeking to exercise their most fundamental right in any free society, the right to speak freely. Here is Churchill's warning. A state of society where men may not speak their minds, where children denounce their parents to the police, where a businessman or small shopkeeper ruins his competitor by telling tales of his private opinions. Such a state of society cannot long endure if brought into contact with the healthy outside world. This is the state of society the left is taking us toward. And I pray that the American people will bring it into contact with the healthy outside world this November. I yield back.
The gentleman yield?
Yes, I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. I'll just be real brief. I think the gentleman made very good points. I would just note, when you're talking about the left not wanting to hear free speech, I think there's nowhere where we see this more evident than our college campuses nowadays, where conservative speakers are either barred or shouted down. And if there's any place where we ought to invite free speech, and there ought to be an open debate on both sides, and let the students consider what their views are as they're growing intellectually and otherwise, it ought to be on college campuses. So the left is just making a mess of those college campuses right now by inhibiting free speech.
And this, I'm concerned, goes even farther, because it's not just censoring people for their opinions and their words. they are now actively using the power of government to intimidate people from even thinking of expressing those freedoms.
I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to first thank you for bringing this very important piece of legislation, which I'm proud to co-sponsor, to the table, especially H.R. 350, the Domestic Terrorism Act. In the past several years, incidents of domestic terrorism have struck communities across our country. HBCUs were recently terrorized by a wave of bomb threats. Asian Americans were the victims of unconscionable violence, and Latinos have been targeted for cultural and ethnic cleansing. In 2019, a domestic terrorist killed 23 people, most of whom were Latino, while shopping at a Walmart store. The largest terrorist attack targeting Latinos in modern U.S. history. The shooter candidly manifested his intention to put a supposed cultural and ethnic replacement brought on by Latinos, to put a stop to it. I'm proud and thankful to my friend and colleague, Ms. Escobar of Texas, for her leadership in introducing legislation to honor and remember the victims and survivors of that heinous act of terrorism fueled by white supremacy. The El Paso Community Healing Garden will be a national memorial for reflection and healing. And as she said earlier during the hearing, this should be a nonpartisan bill, something that would bring communities together. And I hope that she succeeds in doing what she wants to do for her community's healing process. In Houston, we have a memorial to help our community heal also. We have built a monument in memory of Jose Joe Campos Torres, a 23-year-old, a veteran, a Mexican-American. He was beaten, brutally murdered by 2 police officers, driven by hate, racism, and white supremacy. This, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, is a domestic terrorism that Latino communities have endured for decades, but often overlooked. African Americans, Asians, Muslims, and Latinos have and continue to fall victims of domestic terrorism, but no more. And these heinous acts are left unanswered, they will continue. Doing nothing is simply not an option. This bipartisan legislation provides the resources and tools that law enforcement and communities need to combat these threats. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation before us. And Mr. Chairman, just one final note. It is just really troubling to see some of the discussion at this table that just simply makes up stuff. You know, I sit here and have the other side of the aisle try to suggest what I'm thinking or what some of us on this side of the aisle are thinking. A lot of it is frankly just made up stuff. I think we need to move on, and as was suggested by someone, we need to look at facts. And the facts are, we need this bill. We need to do something about domestic terrorism before it truly, truly gets out of control. With that, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, I'm always interested to learn priorities. And what we saw from the gentleman from Rhode Island talking about priorities and trying to sweep under the rug the vast array of claims from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to defund police, quote after quote after quote on the record, calling for the defunding of the police, and then to claim $350 billion to go to solve that problem. Yet the Washington Post, in all of its right-wing nuttery glory, fact-checked erroneous claim by Democrats and Jen Psaki that the GOP, rather than progressives, had defunded the police. They gave them 3 Pinocchios, quote, significant factual error and or obvious contradictions, i.e. mostly false. The $350 billion was to go to state and local aid, to sweep aside actually funding the police after local police were defunded, while crime skyrockets across the country. We know this to be true, but you know what, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't like to talk about those facts. When we had a hearing in here about the heartbeat bill, I said, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will not mention the word heartbeat the rest of this hearing. Guess what? They didn't. Because heartbeat doesn't really help the agenda, talking about a heartbeat, does it? And here, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about dead Americans. Also, not very helpful to the agenda. 5,000 dead Americans, as my colleague from North Carolina pointed out. None of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to talk about those 5,000 dead Americans, do they? Not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about the skyrocketing murder rates in the 12 major cities that broke their homicide records in 2021, all had Democratic mayors. Not helpful for the agenda. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about victims of crime, that 89% of black victims were killed by black offenders. We don't want to talk about that or talk about ways we can address that because it's not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to talk about the dead Americans from fentanyl. 100,000 dead Americans from drug overdoses and poisonings. Don't want to talk about that. Not helpful to the open borders agenda causing Americans to die. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they don't want to talk about the deaths piling up from this body's COVID policies. Suicides, mental health issues, people dying because they couldn't get health care because of lockdowns. No. Let's just run away from that. Let's just sweep that aside. Let's not talk about excess deaths. Let's not dive into and have hearing after hearing about excess deaths when we're talking about tens of thousands of Americans of excess deaths for non-COVID natural causes. Are we studying that data? No, because it's not helpful to the agenda. My colleagues simply don't want to talk about these issues. They don't want to talk about the dead that are resulting from radical environmental unicorn energy policies around the world. We're seeing play out in real time because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are so committed to their radical leftist environmental energy agenda that they want to bury their head in the sand as to what's actually happening when you don't drill for American oil and gas and have a strong position in the world to ensure that we've got energy abundance to make sure that we're secure, free, and have the energy we need. No, that's not helpful to the agenda. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, you know what I never hear from my constituents? I never hear from my constituents, oh, please give the Department of Justice more power. Please, Congressman Roy, will you please give the Department of Homeland Security more power? I just please. Please, Congressman Roy, will you please give the FBI more power? I want the FBI up in my grill. I want the FBI targeting my parents. I want the FBI targeting Americans for daring to question the holy grail of school boards. Yeah, I get those questions a lot. And I would just point out in closing, following up with Mr. Jordan's points, the FBI's counterterrorism criminal divisions created a threat tag, EDU officials, to track instances of related threats according to the email from a whistleblower. The purpose of the threat tag is to help scope this threat on a national level and provide an opportunity for analysis of the threat picture for effective engagement with law enforcement. That's what this bill would do. It would empower federal bureaucrats, federal authorities to go after the American people. And that's why we're opposing it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. We remember in 2015 when a white supremacist entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and executed 9 Christians praying, including Reverend Pinckney, a state senator. Remember in 2018, a violent white nationalist anti-Semite entered the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and murdered 11 people during a Saturday morning prayer service, the deadliest mass attack on Jewish Americans in US history. 2019, we remember an extremist jacked up on hatred of Hispanics entered a Walmart and murdered 23 people in El Paso, Texas, in the largest terrorist attack on Hispanics in modern US history. These were actions, these were deeds, these were not words. This was not language, these were violent events. Remember on January 6th, a violent, seditious mob smashed our windows, broke down our doors, and wounded, injured, and hospitalized more than 150 of our police officers in order to storm the Capitol and shut down the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history. Some of those rioters and insurrectionists brandished Confederate battle flags and neo-Nazi regalia, such as T-shirts saying Camp Auschwitz staff on them. Several people died in this mass attack on the US Capitol. Many members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, denounced this as terrorism, even as some of our colleagues tried to blame it on Antifa, including Mr. Gates, on January 6th itself. But regardless of whether you think it was Antifa or, as all the evidence demonstrates, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Aryan Nations and the militia groups, regardless of who did it, it was domestic terrorism. It was a domestic terrorist attack on the government of the United States. And where were all the champions of law enforcement? Some of them refused even to vote to extend the Congressional Medal of Honor to the police officers who risked their lives to save them on that day. Mr. Chairman, I support this legislation strongly. It defines domestic terrorism as criminal acts dangerous to human life intended to intimidate or coerce the civilian population, to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. It applies to terrorists of any stripe, right, left, center, green, purple, yellow, whatever it is. And it shows a total focus on criminal actions and deeds, not on words. It applies to anyone who would engage in terrorist actions against the people of the United States. It creates domestic terrorism offices within DHS, DOJ, and the FBI. It requires reports. It promotes anti-terrorism training, and it establishes an interagency domestic terrorism task force. It is amazing and breathtaking to me that we have colleagues who are opposing legislation designed to counter the surge in domestic terrorist activity against our people all over America, and that came to this building. Senator Lindsey Graham himself said we all could have died that day. They could have had a bomb. And yet our colleagues instead continue to ride absurd pet little ideological crusades about critical race theory. Come on, give me a break. People are dying in these attacks, in churches, in synagogues, in mosques, in Walmarts. It came to the Capitol of the United States. Democracy is under siege all over the world by violent authoritarianism. And our colleagues, for some reason, refuse to stand up against it. Just like some of our colleagues are soft on Russia and soft on Putin, who they consider a genius, along with Donald Trump, whose brilliance and savvy they praise. They are soft on defending America against violent right-wing authoritarianism. Enough is enough. Let's take on domestic terrorism. Let's pass this legislation. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. For what purposes the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to add to the record a letter of support from the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, a coalition of 230 national organizations who support this bill.
Without objection.
Thank you.
For what purposes Mr. Issa seek recognition?
Move to strike last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, gentlelady just moments ago, or her previous time, said we make things up. Well, let me give you some facts. First of all, for a very long time, the vast majority of people on both sides of the aisle have said Vladimir Putin is a murderer. We have, on a bipartisan basis, for years tried to rein in this thug who murders his political opponents, poisons them, and the like. So I appreciate people talking about, made-up facts, but let's understand that this Congress has, in fact, been pushing hard on, and I give credit to both sides, all the way back to Chairman Tom Lantos and Henry Hyde, to rein in an out-of-control country and dictator who today murders his neighbors in massive numbers. Moving on to the bill itself, I just want to make sure I'm dealing with fact. The bill's summary, H.R. 350, addresses domestic terrorism and hate crimes through several requirements, including authorized domestic terrorism components of the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice and the FBI investigations. But what it says specifically that is important, it says, creating an interagency task force on white supremacists and neo-Nazi infiltration of the uniformed services and law enforcement, and assigning a special agent to hate crime liaison for each FBI field office. This is a large bureaucracy designed to go after our men and women in uniform, both military and law enforcement. Let's not forget its own language points to looking at and terrorizing, if you will, our men and women who serve us in harm's way. And I think the fact that that's in the language makes it undeniable, and hopefully the gentlelady will assume that I didn't make up what I just read when she sees it on her own sheets. Now, I voted for the Patriot Act, and I have been part of reforming the Patriot Act every time it has come back up because it has been overused. And the idea that we're going to use it more at this time makes very little sense. But let me just give you one more fact. The chairman continues to say white supremacists, growth of white supremacists. Let's just go to the 2019 FBI figures, which breaks down hate crimes based on a number of factors as to what they're for. But when we look at when they were based on, according to 2019 figures, when they were based on race as a factor, 52.5% of the perpetrators were white, but 76% of the population is white. 23.9% of the perpetrators were black, but only 13.4% of the population is black. Now, I'm not saying anything about black people or white people, except that you cannot point only to white people and say that somehow hate crimes are done by one particular group, when in fact, as a percentage of population, that isn't even supported by the facts. So the idea that we're going after white policemen, white military personnel, just simply doesn't seem to make any sense when I look at the pure numbers. So the idea that we're going to put in every single office in America a special person to go after white law enforcement and white military personnel would certainly seem to be inappropriate. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time to the ranking member.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I would just point out that the gentleman from Maryland talked about how he can't believe Republicans are opposed to this legislation. Well, we're not the only ones who have concerns. Story in Politico last spring from Betsy Woodruff Swan, memo reveals DOJ pushback on domestic terrorism bill. Turns out, in her story, the memo she got a chance to look at, longtime dedicated career lawyers at DOJ have problems. Here's what they said in the memo. It is unnecessary and potentially harmful to establish a dedicated domestic terrorism office within the counterterrorism section. They further say that this could reduce synergy and our counterterrorism efforts and deny our attorneys the benefit of cross-pollination. They have concerns. So the career people have concerns with this legislation, not to mention everything we've said thus far about how this has been used to go after moms and dads. With that, I'd yield back.
The gentleman yields back for purposes. The gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
1 year after insurrectionists violently attempted to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election, I am proud to vote to advance the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. This is a bill that will focus federal law enforcement on the grave threat that violent domestic extremists pose to the safety of our communities and the future of our democracy. Consider the facts. Last year, the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security jointly reported that, quote, the most lethal domestic violent extremist threat to the United States for the last several years came from white supremacists and anti-government extremists. In January, Assistant Attorney General Matthew Olsen testified before our colleagues in the United States Senate that the number of FBI investigations of suspected domestic violent extremism has doubled since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, driven by the increasing threat from those same groups. The link between bigotry and hostility to our democracy should not come as a surprise. At the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, the people who tried to violently overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election carried Confederate flags and wore Holocaust regalia. In fact, our nation's first domestic terrorism statutes, the three Klan Acts of 1870 and 1871, rested on this insight that attacks on the rights and lives of the marginalized are attacks on our democracy itself. So I am proud to advance the tradition of those historic bills today, Mr. Chairman. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act is particularly important for the fight against violent anti-Semitism. I am outraged that over the last few years, we have seen a shameful surge in anti-Semitic violence in my district, in this country, and across the globe. Even though Jews are just 2% of the American population, they were the victims of over 50% of the religiously motivated hate crimes committed in the year 2020. In December 2019, there was even a horrific act of anti-Semitic violence in my own district, in the hamlet of Muncie, a lethal assault on Hasidic Jews celebrating Hanukkah. So it is my honor to represent diverse and dynamic Jewish communities across Rockland and Westchester counties in New York State. As a Black American, I feel a particular kinship with my Jewish neighbors. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said to the American Jewish Congress, our unity is born of our common struggle for centuries, not only to rid ourselves of bondage, but to make oppression of any people by others an impossibility. No one should have to feel afraid to be Jewish. Indeed, no one should have to live in fear because of how they worship, what they look like, who they love, or who they are. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act takes critical steps towards defeating the most heinous and menacing sources of those fears. The bill will help ensure federal law enforcement understands, prioritize, and confront violent white supremacy and neo-Nazism by creating units in the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI focused on these threats, including, yes, the infiltration of law enforcement and the military. We commit to meeting this challenge. By requiring regular reports on these forms of domestic extremism from our nation's law enforcement agencies, this bill will result in valuable information and resources for our ongoing efforts to understand and overcome violent bigotry in all its forms. And by directing these new units to collaborate with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, this bill helps steer law enforcement towards the gravest dangers to our most targeted communities. In closing, let me say this. As a member of Congress, I nearly lost my life, like so many other folks in this room, in one of the worst incidents of white supremacist domestic terrorism in our nation's history. And that is the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th that unfortunately too many of my Republican colleagues try to whitewash. So today and always, I stand with everyone vulnerable to the threat of violent domestic extremism and all forms of hatred because our democracy depends on it. Make no mistake about that. because we all deserve to live our lives free from fear and violence, and of course, because we can only overcome these threats together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Big seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in opposition to this bill, and I associate myself to the comments made by so many of my colleagues on this side of the aisle. I just want to make three points that I think are salient. You may not think so, but I do. But I think they're salient. And the first one is this. This language in here that specifically attacks law enforcement agencies and our military forces, that's what it is. It is an attack on our police forces and our military forces. And you already see jurisdictions throughout this country that cannot hire, cannot recruit enough police officers because of the defund police movement that so many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle embrace. This lack of respect for law enforcement, this lack of respect for the rule of law is actually indicated by this language of this bill. And so that's point one. You're going to continue to demoralize our military and our police force, which will in turn lead to a weakening of the rule of law, continued weakening of the rule of law. Second thing is, this notion, what this bill does is emphasize that domestic terrorism originates from white supremacists. I want to point out three quick examples of where domestic terrorism has been actually where they've been interdicted and prosecuted. So, less than a month ago, 3 men pleaded guilty to crimes related to conspiring to attack power grids throughout the U.S. in a domestic terrorism case. There is domestic terrorism prosecutions that go on a regular basis here. Under the current status of the law, this, as a ranking member pointed out, will actually undermine further prosecutions and will instead divert attention away from domestic terrorists. I want to give you two specific incidents. In April of a year ago, BLM violently captured and took over the Oklahoma State Capitol. Why? They didn't like the bills that were being passed, so they took over the Capitol, violently so. Is that domestic terrorism? Some might think yes. And just last October, in what witnesses described as similar to the January 6th incident, protesters stormed the Interior Department because they were upset about environmental issues. Were they domestic terrorists? Would they be encompassed under current law? Probably under current law. You don't need this legislation. The third thing I would say is you're expanding the scope of power of the federal government, which, as Mr. Roy so eloquently put, is not what my constituency is asking for. My constituency is asking, where is the Department of Homeland Security? Why do we have rampant, wide open border on my state, Arizona-Mexico border? When I talk to one of our sheriffs, local sheriffs, who's dealing with the impact of the open border caused by failure of the federal government, he gave me this story. His deputies came across a lady who had a bag of pills. They were inquiring what the pills were because the Tucson sector is the #1 drug trafficking corridor on President Biden's open border. So they asked her what kind of pills they were. She said, well, I knew I would be raped multiple times when I crossed. So these are morning after pills. That's fact. That's the fact of an inhumane open border. We were just down there again last weekend. Every month I go to the border, different portions of the border. People were coming across last weekend. I couldn't be there, I was here voting, but my staff was there. individuals crossing illegally at 1 per minute. 1 per minute. The terrorists who were apprehended last year were more than 5 times the highest ever. I'm saying this bill is unnecessary, it's bad, but do something about the border. Join us. Let's secure our border, let's secure our nation. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the health and well-being and safety of the American people is our number one responsibility. As a 27-year law enforcement officer who had the honor of serving as a chief of police, I depended on Congress, as many law enforcement executives did, to help support us in our efforts to protect all, to keep all communities safe. You see, law enforcement did not have the luxury of picking and choosing which communities we wanted to protect. Mr. Chairman, how did we get here? How did we get here when we can no longer come together to address domestic terrorism and hate crimes? The most powerful nation in the world. How did we get here? The Pulse nightclub is in my district. Mr. Chairman, I believe we are here because coming together just doesn't support a particular political agenda. Now, let me be clear. Law enforcement officers, the men and women that I served with for almost 3 decades, they're pretty clear-eyed. Oh, they're clear about what their oath says to protect and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But it appears some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may have forgotten just what our oath says and the responsibility that we have to that oath. Mr. Chairman, regardless of how desperate some on the other side of the aisle may be to push a political agenda in these very threatening and scary, horrible times in our nation and in our world, our primary responsibility remains protecting the health and safety of the American people. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, I do urge my colleagues, let's remember why we are here. We can debate a whole lot of things. The health and safety and well-being of the American people should never be one of the things we compromise for political gain. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And with that,
Madam, would you yield for a moment?
Yes, I'll yield, Mr.
Thank
Cohen.
you. As a law enforcement professional, do you consider the FBI a law enforcement agency?
Certainly.
And is the law enforcement, FBI, the most senior law enforcement agency in the United States of America?
Definitely.
And so if you support law enforcement and you support enforcement of the criminal laws of this country, you should support the FBI and have confidence in the FBI and not disparage them with some of the remarks we've heard today. Is that not correct?
Everybody counts and everybody is accountable. And yes, we should support our law enforcement from the federal level down to the local level. But that also means that we hold them accountable as well because we want them to do the best job, not on behalf of politics, but on behalf of the American people.
Let me ask you this. You're a Democrat, as am I. I was a police legal advisor in starting my career. I've never called for defunding the police, and I believe 95% of the Democratic caucus has never called for defunding the police. Would you submit that's probably accurate?
I think defunding the police is crazy, and I think the percentage may be higher than 95% have certainly not called for defunding the police. It might make for great political theater, but there again, we are in tough times, and we need to come together to support our law enforcement agencies so we can protect the American people.
And one last question. Did you vote for the American Rescue Plan that gave state and local governments $350 billion to help law enforcement?
I did. Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield.
The gentlelady's time has expired. For what purposes Mr. Benz seek recognition?
Strike last word, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just think there's one extremely, well, before I say this, I want to join my colleagues my colleagues on this side of the aisle regarding their concerns over the content of this bill. But there's one interesting element that I think needs to be mentioned. And that is, this bill is supposed to be based on Section 23315, Title 18 of the Code, which defines domestic terrorism, which means activities that involve acts dangerous to human life. Acts dangerous to human life. And if you go into this bill, you'll see that it actually expands beyond acts. What it refers to is activity, terrorism activity. So I would ask, what is terrorism activity? It's not the act, because if it was the act, that would be subject to prosecution. And so this bill goes beyond that. What it's really suggesting is that our federal agencies become involved, infiltrate, and look into things before they happen. And we've heard reference to this, but this is a extension of government into...
Would the gentleman yield for an answer?
Of course.
Activity refers to planning planning or organizing for acts of terrorism.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And where are you reading that?
I'm not reading it at all, but that's what it means.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, but it would be far more beneficial to all of us that don't have the opportunity to hear your definition to have it included in the bill. And so I'm just saying that leaving it open leads others to, perhaps agencies, to suggest that they could get into the meetings and other things by infiltration and then point at this bill as a justification. I want to refer back to Mr. McClintock's remarks regarding Winston Churchill's concerns about protecting our freedoms. Now, I am opposed to all things white supremacist. Of course I am, we all are. But at the same time, we have to make sure we protect our freedoms. I want to call out, actually, so the record is clear, that on page 3, paragraph 1, domestic terrorism unit reads lines 8 and 9, Homeland Security, which shall be responsible for monitoring, whatever that means, and analyzing domestic terrorism activities. Now, the bill is, shall we say, loosely written in that in different portions thereafter, it refers to acts. But then if you jump ahead to page 11, line 10, it reads, shall focus their limited resources on the most significant domestic terrorism threats. Okay, is a threat an act? No. And so what I'm suggesting that if this bill is going to go forward, there needs to be a great deal more work done on the definition portions of it. And I strongly recommend we do this before we move forward on this bill. With that, I yield to Congressman Tiffany.
Thank you to the member from Oregon. I just want to address the gratuitous comments that were made by the gentleman from Maryland in regards to equating President Trump and Vladimir Putin. If that was actually the case, that the president was attempting to help the Russians, he sure did an awful job of it. And I'd first start with that there was no Russia collusion. And I know some people still believe that because they don't believe that there was Russia collusion because they don't read anything else. But all you got to do is look at the Mueller report. And then all you have to do is read some of the fine print in the Washington Post over the last number of months, and you'll see that they have acknowledged that there was no Russia collusion. In fact, it is something we should look further into in regards to other candidates who may have engaged in Russia collusion. But let's take a look at the actions over the last couple years
We had $60 a barrel crude oil. President Trump left office. It's now $100 a barrel. Why did that happen? Because we decided no longer to be energy independent, and that started on January 20th of 2021 with the shutdown of Keystone and all the other things that have happened since then to take away energy independence. Let's look at the Nord Stream pipeline, which was okayed by the Biden administration, an act that followed shortly after the January 20th, 2021 shutting down Keystone. And you have energy independence gone for America, and Vladimir Putin has used that additional $40 a barrel that he's making now, $100 versus $60, back on January 19th of 2021. He's used that to fund his war machine. So it's very clear that the previous president certainly did more to keep Vladimir Putin at bay than the current president is doing, including offering defensive weapons to Russia's neighbors. I yield back to the gentleman from Oregon.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so glad that we're here today to consider this bill. Sorry, just distracted here for a minute. In last month's subcommittee hearing on crime, and in hearings we've held over the past several years, we've heard from experts about continued violence against minority institutions like HBCUs and houses of worship. The data that we have is clear. Domestic terrorism and hate-based violence are alarmingly on the rise, and white nationalists, extremist militia members, and other violent far-right extremists pose the biggest threat. These domestic terrorists use conspiracy theories, disinformation, and false narratives to recruit new extremist group members, sow distrust in our government, and encourage acts of violence. These kinds of horrifying hate-filled incidents cannot be normalized. Quite frankly, I'm shocked that our colleagues across the aisle who claim to be the party of law and order, but with their rhetoric and efforts to pit Americans against each other, have become soft on terrorism, as long as the terrorists are on their side. I join my Democratic colleagues in condemning terrorism, no matter the source, foreign or domestic, left or right. And I join my colleagues in recognizing that the federal government has an important role to play here. We can and must work to prevent this violence and protect our communities. This bipartisan legislation will make our country safer by giving law enforcement the tools needed to effectively combat domestic terrorism. I encourage all my colleagues to support this bill, and I look forward to passing it out of committee today. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been listening with great interest this morning. Certainly want to associate myself with the comments made by my colleagues on this side of the aisle. We've really heard some absurd statements this morning out of our Democrat colleagues. We were all intrigued on this side to hear just a few moments ago the suggestion that now the Democrats claim they are the ones who support and want to fund law enforcement. And of course, that must be a joke. I mean, it must be a joke. We have long videos of highlights of virtually, seemingly every member of the Democrat caucus in the House breathlessly saying over the last year and a half or so that they wanted to defund the police. And clearly there's a big chunk of the caucus that has made it their #1 issue, including a couple of members of this committee. I think in particular Congresswoman Bush and Mr. Jones and others that this is the thing they talk about all the time. And so I was just curious to hear some of my friends over there disclaiming this when their own colleagues are sitting down the aisle. Let me rebut a couple of things that were said. Someone has said here just a few moments ago that the American Rescue Plan gave money to law enforcement. That's not true. It did not explicitly give any money to law enforcement. It gave money to states and localities to spend as they see fit. Now, thankfully, some of them have used wisdom and applied it appropriately with the shocking rise in violent crime, the rising crime rate, and they've spent it in that manner. But that was not by the direction of the Democrats in Congress. Come on. I mean, we've seen historical revisionism, but this is just absurd. I sent a letter to President Biden on July 22nd of last year asking him to direct the Treasury Department to specify that a portion of the American Rescue Plan funds be devoted to law enforcement. You know what I got in response? Nothing. I CC'd Secretary Yellen. Nothing. That did not come from the White House. It did not come from the Democrats of Congress. And look, the American people are onto this. It's a joke. I want to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Bishop.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I was struck. The thing I love about Mr. Bentz is he always reads every word carefully, and there's no substitute for that. And to a point that he made, and it triggered a thought in me that I thought also worth making here. When we talk about this domestic terrorism terminology being sort of reinvented constantly, blurred in terms of what's being talked about, and sort of transformed into, amazingly enough, a cudgel to use for a political agenda. That's what has transformed this situation from this bill passing on voice a year ago to where we are today. But the point Mr. Bentz made on pages 11 of the bill and page 12, a reference to domestic terrorism threats, the terminology domestic terrorism threats. So you got the question of what does terrorism activity relate to? You had that interaction with the chairman, and of course that term's yet another one, and it made me think of this. Department of Homeland Security on February 7 issued from the National Terrorism Advisory System a summary of terrorism threat to the U.S. homeland. And included among the items that it lists are the proliferation of false or misleading narratives which sow discord or undermine public trust in U.S. government institutions. That's the domestic terrorism threat of a threat actor. Okay. And this is not something that's just written on the back of an envelope. This is from the National Terrorism Advisory System. I mean, I don't even know who's responsible for it. I intend to find out when Republicans are in control. But if you go down further, it makes reference to there's widespread online proliferation of false or misleading narratives regarding unsubstantiated widespread election fraud and COVID-19. So we're back to where we were. I thought we were past that by now, where if you had a lab leak theory you were interested in and decided to advance that, you were shunned from Facebook for a time. Now you're a domestic threat actor. So why in the world would we be at all concerned that this bill, that the new authorities and structures created at the FBI might be turned wrong against Americans who are expressing First Amendment activity? And with that, I yield back to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Well said. I yield back. I'm out of time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the Republican Party may find it hard to believe. Maybe they are in denial, or they just simply don't know. But the fact of the matter is that domestic terrorism and hate crime is nothing new in this country. It has existed from the inception of this country. And it has been perpetrated by those who look like my friends on the other side of the aisle. And the victims have looked like me. And they look like Sheila Jackson Lee. And they look like Jerry Nadler and Steve Cohen, two Jews. And they've looked like Ms. Garcia, who one of my colleagues referred to as a young lady, Judge Garcia. They have looked like Ted Lieu. They have looked like Mondaire Jones, LGBTQ. These are people who sit on this side of the aisle, and so we know what domestic terrorism and hate crime is all about. I'm from the great state of Georgia, representing eastern suburbs of Atlanta. Atlanta was the place where 1 year ago today, 8 people killed by a white supremacist, 6 women killed, 8 people shot, 6 Asian women. And that community has lived in terror since then. And it's no doubt that there's a need for H.R. 350. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle just don't want to believe that there's a need for it because it has a specific focus on white supremacists. Why? White supremacist violence. Why? That's where the hate crime has been coming from. That's the rise in hate crime. It was so vividly illustrated, the rise in hate crime, to the world to see on January 6th of 2021. And nobody will ever forget that white man with the Confederate flag, a big one, walking through the Capitol as one of the insurrectionists. We'll never forget the hangman's noose and the gallows that were set up. Those are triggers for us because we know what that means. The KKK, which was made up in part of police officers and law enforcement officials, sheriffs, and people in the military, we know that there's a need for there to be legislation that would root out those kinds of people from our law enforcement communities and from our military. We know that the figures show that incidents motivated by race, ethnicity, or ancestry have increased dramatically. We know that the Center for Strategic and International Studies showed that domestic terrorism in 2020 was at its highest level of any year the organization has analyzed. And according to CSIS, since 2015, right-wing extremists have been involved in 267 plots or completed attacks and 91 fatalities. And just under half of these fatalities were in connection with an attack that involved white supremacy. So the problem, my brothers on the other side of the aisle, I don't see any sisters over there, but the problem is real. And the people on this side of the aisle, we know it's real because we've been victimized by it throughout history. So we've been the victims, and the folks who've been the victimizers look like y'all. And maybe that's why you are not willing to admit that this is a problem that needs to be addressed by this legislation, but I'm glad that we have the majority so that we can do something about it, because when my friends on the other side of the aisle, if they should ever claim the majority, we're gonna be on the menu, and it does not look good. So we're gonna have to get out here and make sure that that doesn't happen, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for
Mr. Chairman, I'd like the words taken down of the gentleman.
Would the gentleman like to rephrase?
I'll retract.
Okay.
I accept that, thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
As to strike the last word.
And Mr. Chairman, I forgot if I might. Okay, all right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to
Gentleman's
strike the
recognized.
last word. Thank you. It's amazing. I have been part of this hearing virtually, and listening to the comments, and I've been quite surprised. It's amazing how many times we heard defund the police, and then to hear you didn't hear what your lying ears and eyes have been telling you you heard. Move along. There's nothing to see or hear here because we have not advocated for defund the police. It doesn't take, well, you need to use something besides Google, but if you do a proper search, not a Google search, but a proper search that's not adversely affected by the Ministry of Truth, then you'll find plenty of quotes from friends across the aisle who wanted to defund the police, including two people on our committee on the Democrat side, not the Republican side. And when we hear that Republicans voted against Capitol Police getting the Medal of Honor, I can tell you as one person that voted against that bill, I was not against them getting the Medal of Honor. I was against having any lies in the bill as part of the recitation. This is something we've seen over and over, where Democrats will put something meritorious, something we can all agree on the bill, and then put a lie in there as part of a recitation so that, oh, well, if you vote for the thing we all agree on, then we can use that against you and say, you admitted that this falsity was true. And so some of us just have a problem voting for things that we know are not true. It's like law enforcement putting a false statement in the middle of a bunch of true statements and asking the witness or the defendant to sign it. It's not appropriate, and nobody should ever sign a statement or vote for a bill that has a ridiculous statement of fact that is not. It is also coming on the heels of being shocked by hearing people on the other side of the aisle actually advocate for what Orwell predicted some 80, 70 years ago. Let's have something which sounds like a ministry of truth, where the government tells us what's true, and then anybody that goes against that is a domestic terrorist, and we'll have them arrested. I haven't heard anybody on the other side advocate for the ministry of love that Orwell talked about, that if you disagreed with the ministry of truth, then you're a domestic terrorist. And in 1984, the ministry of love would come arrest you in some outrageous manner, kind of like the Department of Justice is doing since January 6th. And then they would take you to the basement and torture you until you agreed with whatever the Ministry of Truth said. I mean, it is incredible how far we're going in the wrong direction. We should be coming together. If we're ever going to get to Dr. King's dream, it means we quit advocating for looking at the color of people's skin, that we stop this ridiculous idea of now let's segregate so that one color people can have certain accommodations. I mean, we're going the wrong way. And who's behind the recent rise in U.S. anti-Semitic attacks? This is a BBC article, because it's hard to find a mainstream. We used to call them mainstream, now they're all left. But in this article, it says violence and harassment targeting American Jews broke out coast to coast amid the 11 days of fighting between Israelis and Palestinians that ended in a ceasefire on 20 May. This is from 2021. Incidents including outdoor diners in Los Angeles who were physically attacked by a group carrying Palestinian flags, violence against Orthodox Jews in New York City, home to the largest population of Jews outside of Israel, and Nazi imagery posted on synagogue in Alaska this week. But it goes on to point out that last year saw the third largest or highest number of attacks, and it comes during the Democrats' tectonic shift against Israel. That's worth noting, and it's worth getting into the record. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. 1 year ago today, on March 16th, 2021, the Atlanta community was rocked by the horrific mass shooting on 3 different spas, which took the lives of 8 innocent victims. Now, this was a targeted attack on the Asian American community. And all 3 of the spas, they were owned by Asian Americans. And 6 of those 8 victims were Asian women. These types of hate crimes, they've existed for decades, but they've continued to rise over the past several years. The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act would actually help us to stop these horrendous hate crimes from happening. And it would also help to stop our communities from continuing to reel with the pain and the loss that so many have felt and they continue to feel. DPTA would finally create dedicated domestic terrorism units within our federal executive departments, who would be tasked with monitoring, investigating, and prosecuting cases of domestic terrorism. Additionally, based on joint biannual reporting to Congress, these offices would focus their resources on the most significant threats. And importantly, in preparing these reports, the newly created offices would review hate crime incidents to determine if those incidents constitute domestic terrorism. 1 month ago, our Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security Subcommittee held a hearing on the rise in violence against minority institutions, calling attention to the increased domestic terrorism threats made against historically Black colleges and universities. In my home state of Georgia, 3 institutions have received bomb threats over the past few months. These include Spelman College, Fort Valley State University, and Albany State University. So hate crimes like this undermine the safety and the security of our institutions. So the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021 really makes it much easier for our federal agencies to get the information that they need to keep our schools, our communities, and our nation safer. Domestic terrorism is not just a threat to Atlanta or to HBCUs. It is a threat to all Americans and a threat to our democracy. That's why I strongly urge my colleagues today and every day to vote in the affirmative, but particularly today on this bipartisan bill. It's sorely needed and is sorely past time. And I yield back the remaining.
Will the gentlelady yield?
I yield to my colleague from Maryland.
Thank you so much, Ms. McBath, and also for those clarifying remarks. I needed to intervene because I heard the gentleman from Texas talk about how the Department of Justice is somehow being converted into a ministry of truth. Of course, that has nothing to do with the bill, which is all about responding to actual episodes of domestic violence committed by domestic terrorists. But the gentleman opposes a ministry of truth. He seems to support a ministry of lies. He has bought into
I would ask
Donald
that the
Trump's big
gentleman's
lie.
words be taken down. I do not support lies. I made that clear.
Okay.
I would
Well,
ask
let me pursue
gentleman's
that.
words be taken
got the
down.
floor, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not
Who's got
going to
the floor?
sit here and be told that I favor lies.
The gentleman will suspend.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that the gentleman has endorsed Donald Trump's false claim that he won the 2020 presidential
I have
election.
not done so. I have said there was fraud in the election, and that is being borne out by...
It has been rejected by more than 60.
One at a time.
It doesn't change my motion to have the gentleman's words taken down. I won't sit here and be told that
Does
I
the gentleman-
support lies. That violates the rules.
Does the gentleman from Maryland wish to rephrase?
Let's see. I said that the gentleman from Texas is talking about a ministry of truth. He seems to favor a ministry of lies. I was proceeding to talk about his support for Donald Trump's big lie for Donald
I
Trump's
take it
statement
then the gentleman does not choose to rephrase.
Well, I mean, if he's willing to dissociate himself from Donald Trump's big lie, then I'm delighted to take it down. If he will denounce Donald Trump's big lie.
I take it, the gentleman, if the gentleman will withdraw his comments, we can move on. If not, we'll have to vote on taking the words down.
Based on my understanding that he does not advance Donald Trump's big lie, then I'm happy to say that he is not favoring a ministry of lies based on that stipulation, because I'd understood that he was going along with Donald Trump's big lie, but if he's not, that's terrific, and I just hope Donald Trump doesn't find out.
The gentleman said that I support a ministry of lies. That's a lie, and I demand his words be taken down.
All right, well, if you're willing to dissociate yourself from Donald Trump, then I'm happy to withdraw that, but let me just say this. He said that there were people from January 6th who were being somehow, I don't know, falsely or wrongly prosecuted. I wonder if the gentleman
does not withdraw his remarks. We will have to vote on whether to take down the gentleman's remarks.
Mr. Chair, can I make a parliamentary inquiry? Some of the controversy seems to be over Mr. Gomert's statement that there was a lie in the resolution. If he would tell us what the lie he says was, we could determine whether or not Mr. Raskin's statement is correct or not.
It does not change the fact that he said I was supporting a ministry of lies, and that's not true. He also, want to point it out, he misrepresented what I said. I did not say that the DOJ was, it was a ministry of truth. No, the DOJ is the equivalent of.
Mr. Gomer, what was the lie you were referring to?
Would Mr.
You're
Raskin,
changing the subject from my demand the words be taken down.
Will suspend. Will Mr. Raskin agree that Mr. Gomert was not personally lying?
Oh, I never said he was personally lying.
The gentleman agrees he's personally lying. It is personally not lying. The words, therefore, cannot be.
All I said is I never said that he was lying.
The gentleman will suspend the words. The gentleman has said that he did not call the gentleman from Texas a liar, that he was not personally lying. Therefore, there is no occasion to take down anybody's words. And who had the time? I forget. And Mr. Raskin will continue his remarks. He has a minute and a half left.
I appreciate that. There was some suggestion that there was some false prosecutions going on by the Department of Justice, or people are being hounded. I know some of our colleagues have described people arrested for violent assaults on federal officers and violent invasion of the Capitol and interruption of federal proceeding as political prisoners. And we have people who are somehow claiming to be on the side of the police who have nothing to say about violent assaults on our officers who were injured, wounded, hospitalized, broken necks, broken vertebrae, broken jaws, traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome. We hear nothing about it. It's remarkable. So look, either you're going to oppose domestic terrorism across the board, or you're not. And I oppose it across the board. If you look at the language of this legislation, it puts us squarely against domestic terrorism across the board. But there's some people who seem to want to be forgiving and indulgent of domestic terrorism if it comes from people who they view as being on their side against critical race theory. And that is a very dangerous moment for American democracy when the two major political parties are not standing together against violent domestic terrorism against our institutions. So I think that's just a sorrowful and tragic moment. And none of us should be supporting a ministry of lies or a ministry of truth in the Orwellian sense. We should just be supporting the facts and the law.
The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Reserve a
Chairman,
point
I
of order,
reserve a
sir.
point of order.
The point of order is reserved.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 350, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona. Page 16, line
The
10.
amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many school children received their school lessons through remote learning over the last 2 years, and many parents grew concerned at the ineffectiveness of the virtual classroom, and circumstances of this learning environment have been bad enough. Fortunately, as their children received instruction from their schools under less than optimal circumstances, many parents' eyes were open to what their children were being taught in school. As a result, these concerned parents began attending school board meetings in greater numbers, voicing their outrage at the various anti-American ideals. What was the response of the school boards? Was it to listen to the parents, consult parental input in their children's education? No. School boards had their national association, the National School Board Association, write a letter to President Biden requesting that the Patriot Act be used in an effort to restrain these parents. Obviously, the Patriot Act was never intended to be used in this manner. Former Chairman Sensenbrenner, the primary author of the Patriot Act, stated that the Justice Department, quote, lacks authority to invoke federal anti-terrorism laws to chill protected expressive conduct, close quote. Less than a week after receiving the letter, the Attorney General wrote a memo directing all U.S. attorneys to meet with local law enforcement, and coordinate with the FBI on how to investigate threats against public officials at school board meetings. In a press release that followed the Attorney General's memo, the National Security Division's involvement was mentioned. According to a whistleblower, the FBI's Counterterrorism Division has been tasked with implementing the Attorney General's directive. And Mr. Chairman, without objection, I submit the whistleblower's comments.
Without objection.
Thank you. That whistleblower revealed to us that the FBI created a threat tag, edu officials, to label and track parents. This is unacceptable. My amendment merely ensures that the FBI does not use the edu officials threat tag or create a similar threat tag to identify and track concerned parents. We must ensure that parents do not have their First Amendment rights of speech, petitioning, and assembly trampled by an overzealous federal government. And one way to think of it is, this was brought up earlier by Mr. Bishop, is that just recently, the Secretary of Homeland Security issued a terrorism advisory bulletin, which indicated that widespread online proliferation of false or misleading narratives regarding unsubstantiated widespread election fraud and COVID-19 would be narratives that need to be investigated as domestic terrorism. Similarly, putting a threat tag on parents who merely show up at school board meetings to question the acts of school boards can be very problematic and goes beyond the scope of this bill. That's what this amendment does, and I would urge also, Mr. Chairman, that a November 18, 2021 letter that was submitted to Director Wray by the ranking member be admitted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I will recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. In the past several years...
Mr. Chairman, I believe I have a point of order preserved I'd like to be heard on. No?
The amendment is germane, so there's no...
Yeah, but I withdraw mine. Cicilline may have another one. I don't know.
I'm sorry, I'll withdraw mine as well, Mr. Chairman. I didn't.
Okay, thank you. In the past, the points of order are withdrawn. In the past several years, incidents of domestic terrorism struck communities around our country. HBCUs were recently terrorized by a wave of bomb threats. Asian Americans were the victims of unconscionable violence, and the sanctity of our houses of worship was pierced by hostage-taking and other acts aimed at harming and terrorizing minorities. If these heinous acts are left unanswered, they'll continue. Doing nothing is not an option. This bipartisan legislation provides the resources and tools that law enforcement and communities need to combat these threats. While some Republicans continue to construct straw men to distract from their record on domestic terrorism, we're moving forward with bipartisan legislation that will make our community safer for everyone. And I oppose the amendment because it creates a carve-out to the anti-terrorism legislation essentially for school board officials, it would prevent the beneficial effects of this bill from helping school board and other education officials. So on that basis, I oppose the amendment, and I urge all my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
Speak on the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
It does seem to me, this is the, it's just yielding to the gentleman, make sure, because I was talking to Mr. Government, but this is the one about the threat tag edu officials. Is that correct?
Yes, it is correct. That's the amendment.
So, you know, we've had charges and countercharges, and I regret that members of the majority have twice had to have retract words to avoid having them taken down. And we really ought to be able to have a discussion around this. You know, it's interesting. I think one thing I've seen is I've come up here and been here a relatively short period of time.
I didn't retract any words.
Did somebody interrupt me?
I just asked if you would yield because I didn't retract any words.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
Then I'd ask his words to be taken down. He retracted his retraction.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I understand why there's a little indiscipline there about because you feel badly about what you've said, I'm sure. But, you know, it is striking that we have this situation. Of course, the people on this side of the dais believe we've hit upon something that's of grave concern. We've articulated it, I think, reasonably well. On the other side of the dais, people their breath is taken away. Some have said that we would be concerned about this. But Mr. Biggs's amendment is so simple. How about some show of good faith? Here we are. You know, that we wouldn't know anything about the edu officials threat tag. And I hope I'm not repeating, Mr. Biggs, what you said. As I said, I was partially distracted for a moment. But we wouldn't know that there is a threat tag created, popularized, disseminated around the FBI by the Counterterrorism Division to establish this threat tag edu officials to associate it with parents of school children who went to protest at their school boards. We wouldn't know about it except for an FBI whistleblower. Somebody who came forward, and for the people who are watching at home, I hope somebody is, that they don't even, that it's a, I mean, that's a discretionary disclosure, a confidential disclosure under statute by an FBI agent doesn't reveal his identity in order to avoid retaliation within the FBI. That's the whole reason we know that this threat tag was established by the Counterterrorism Division. And so all in the world that you've asked in this amendment, I think, is that no funds be authorized to go about using that threat tag. I would love to know much more about the threat tag. Why is the Counterterrorism Division involved? I mean, we heard when the U.S. Attorney from the state of Washington testified a week ago before the Crime Subcommittee on that screen that I'm looking at over there, that's where I saw it, and I asked him what sort of threats he was aware of involving school boards, school officials, that he related or imparted to others when he had his assigned meeting by the Attorney General, and he said he wasn't aware of a single one, nor that anybody in those meetings could relate any such threats. In fact, the way he characterized it, he didn't see any threats warranting a nationwide scope of action. And yet we know this was done. So if there's the slightest good faith desire on the part of the majority that's putting this bill through a markup to allay the concerns that are triggered by that sequence of events, even until, you know, notwithstanding that we have been denied the opportunity to obtain a full accounting about it, then what a simple amendment. What would be wrong with that? What would be wrong with taking one step to assure the minority that the concern is genuinely about the threat of domestic terrorism that confronts us all, not about the sort of stuff we see in the Homeland Security Threat Bulletin that I read from earlier, talking about
misleading speech, you know, that is disinformation and misinformation about COVID-19. That is a whole nother animal. And this is such a simple amendment. I thank the gentleman for the amendment, and I look to see whether or not the majority is interested in making the slightest gesture to reassure the minority about what the motivation is that is at hand. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I wanted to highlight again that this bill is not targeted to any named group.
I think it might be.
It is targeted to actions and preventing domestic terrorism. The characterization of my friends, forgive me, is a political talking point to label members on this side of the aisle as, one, not being supportive of police, and frankly, opposing the very people that each and every one of us are. Many of us sitting at this table are parents. Many of us have spoken at school board meetings. We have spoken both or visited or sat or listened at a school board meeting as an active parent or as I have done as a member of Congress. And the only current activity that looked violent in words generated through the last administration, the falsities about masks and vaccinations, and the terrorizing of these parents by the discussion falsely of critical race theory. So these are provoked issues. But at the same time as these are provoked issues, I can assure you that there is a mountain of video of very frightening comments. The last of which was a woman, a mother, that indicated that she was going to get her gun. And who knows what would have been the result of the gun she had and the bullet she had. That video may need to be brought up. And so I would suggest to my good friend that a carve-out suggests there's a target. There is no target. It is about the ability to deal with a wide range of terrorism against religious institutions, people who's different, LGBTQ, ethnic, language. All of that is the basis of this legislation. I thank Mr. Snyder for his thoughtfulness. This is a meaningful bipartisan bill. This is dealing with communities of faith and ethnic minorities and others. And so let it be very clear. I am interested in thoughtful amendments, but I'm interested in saving lives. And thank you, General Garland, and thank you, President Biden and Vice President Harris, for recognizing that in this nation, it is not a sin to talk about race, racism, to talk about anti-Asian hate, which we just honored on the steps of the United States Capitol, of those 8 Korean persons, Asian persons in Atlanta that were murdered by a person that was hateful and used violence. And as someone said at that ceremony, don't attribute it to sex addiction, attribute it to hatefulness. And that generates violence. So all I can say to you is that I don't think this is a constructive amendment. I don't think there is a need to carve out. I don't think there is a threat against school boards. There's not a threat against parents. It is simply a bipartisan effort to deal with the underlying, the undergirding, or the dangers that we've been facing over the years because people are listening to wrong information, wrong-headed information, dangerous information, and most recently it was the last president that we had in the United States who prolonged and provoked and started his campaign on hate, and he continued it for 4 years.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I think I will yield back at this time, and I'm often eager to yield, but I will not at this time. I believe this amendment is not ready and constructive, and I'd be happy to yield back at this time. Thank you.
Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomet, is recognized.
Thank you. To strike the last word on this amendment, just to quote Department of Homeland Security Counterterrorism Coordinator John Cohen, he testified that the DHS hasn't not found evidence of rising violence against educators, refuting the ostensible reason that Attorney General Merrick Garland launched an ongoing investigation into the matter. Cohen said, quote, "We did reach out to state and local law enforcement. There have been some sporadic instances of violence at school board meetings and in educational facilities. However, the information we received is that state and local law enforcement are not seeing widespread action," unquote. I would yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding an important set of statistics. The example just used by the chair, distinguished chair of the crime subcommittee, of a woman making a threat to go get a gun. Well, that's not covered in this amendment, is it? She's not protected in this amendment because the amendment says you can't put that kind of tag on somebody with respect to parents voicing an opinion about the upbringing and education of their children. That would not protect someone who actually makes a threat. Now, in keeping with that, when from the document just read by Mr. Gomer, there is no widespread threat that's against school boards, number one. Number two, who should take that up if there is the sporadic threat? Local law enforcement. And they do. They do a good job, and they take that up. And then I just want to comment on something, what I think is a much broader issue. And this is when the distinguished chair was talking about wrong-headed thoughts. Too many people listening to wrong-headed thoughts, something to that effect. In America, free speech, the First Amendment protects speech. Where we have carved out and is if there's threats of use of speech to threaten and intimidate. We say that's no good. You yell fire in a crowded theater, you're not allowed to do that. If you commit fraud, we punish fraud. But if I have an opinion about an election that apparently the Department of Homeland Security finds that's not orthodox, that if I have a heterodox opinion about something, that can be classified as domestic terrorism. Whatever happened to the notion that you can have an opinion and express it in America, no matter how repugnant, unless it induces to violence or fraudulent conduct? This bill undermines that. This amendment is just a small step to right the bigger wrong of this bill. With that, I'm going to yield now I've got to yield back to Mr. Gomer, who controls the time.
Yeah, yield to my friend.
Mr. Gomer, would you
Bishop.
yield?
Well,
He's already
yield
yielded to me, so I'll yield back momentarily. I thank the gentleman for yielding. And I know that when I asked the distinguished chairman of the crime subcommittee to engage in a colloquy about her opposition to the amendment, she declined to do that, declined even an interaction on this dais about this amendment. And the question I would have posed is, what harm does the amendment do? Even if you find it not well-founded or insignificant or attending to something that's not necessary to be attended to, at least I can say it was interesting. Back in the General Assembly in North Carolina, we would take minority amendments like that simply to allay concerns and to attempt to develop support for the bill. And I just wondered, that doesn't seem to happen here. And I guess there's something else to read into that. But I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
The gentleman yield?
And I would quote George Orwell, "Free speech is my right to say what you don't want to hear." Who was wanting to?
The gentleman yield?
Yield to Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, I would just ask the question, how many people have that designation that's in the amendment, the threat tag designation associated with their names today? How many parents? And maybe the more important question is, why don't Democrats want to know that? Why wouldn't you want to, if this is a rampant problem, as the Attorney General said, based solely on the letter from the School Board Association, which they've now apologized for, if it's all over the place, then we'd like to know the number. Or is it more like what Mr. Bishop brought up, where we heard from the U.S. Attorney last week, and he said 0 cases in his jurisdiction? So I don't know why you guys don't want to know. And the guy who can answer that is the Attorney General, if you just bring him back and let us talk to him.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Yeah, I guess it has.
I'll now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just say in response first to Mr. Biggs' argument of why not just pass the amendment even though it's irrelevant, it's responding to an issue that doesn't exist, what's the harm? Well, I mean, we have a very important piece of legislation before us that's intended to respond to a real problem. I don't think we ought to spend lots of time on imaginary things. And just in case there's any question about it, no matter how often our colleagues try to make the claim, there is in fact no such tag as it relates to parents. Not only do we have the sworn testimony of the Attorney General of the United States, but we have the actual memo, the big explosive email that says, in fact, doesn't contain the word parent. And it says instead that in order to address a spike in harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, goes on to say we share an obligation to ensure all individuals are able to do their jobs without the threats of violence or fear for their safety. And it goes on to say that we have to discourage and identify and prosecute those who use violence, threats of violence, and other forms of intimidation and harassment pertaining to this threat.
Will the gentleman
So
yield?
this has to do with threats of violence. Now, if you still have any question in your mind as to whether or not this bogus claim that parents are being tagged when the Attorney General of the United States said no under oath, when the letter itself doesn't even contain the word parents, I have a third piece of evidence for you to consider. And the title of the fact check is FBI is not using threat tags on parents who protest at school board meetings. They go through it and say it is completely false. So like, this is an interesting made up thing. I know it's proved to be valuable politically. It will be played on Fox News and you'll all raise money from it. The fact of the matter is there's no basis in fact for this claim.
Would the gentleman yield?
This amendment is silly and there's no basis in fact to take up the time of this important committee on an issue that doesn't exist.
Would the
So
gentleman
let's
yield?
vote it down and be done with it. I don't know if any of my colleagues, Mr. Raskin, I'm happy to yield to you if you have any additional thoughts.
How about me, Mr. Cicilline? Would you yield?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cicilline, for yielding. But I would like to pose a question to you, Mr. Cicilline, which is, this was really not an issue to begin with, as you point out. There was no witch hunt going on against parents in any way. There was an apology made immediately, it was retracted, and yet some people are making a bigger deal out of this than January the 6th. Some people are making a bigger deal out of this than Vladimir Putin's invasion of the Ukraine with the encouragement and cheerleading of Donald Trump, who called him a genius. What is behind this obsessive, ridiculous focus on a non-issue?
I thank the gentleman for the question. And, I think what is particularly disappointing, and I think it's very clear, sadly, that our friends on the other side of the aisle have seen some political value, have seen somehow arguing, as all of us would strongly be against, that parents shouldn't be somehow involved in the education of their children. And in fact, they can be tagged as terrorists for attending a school board meeting. Well, everyone would think that's a crazy idea. And of course, everyone's against that. But to the extent they can make the bogus claim that the Attorney General of the Department of Justice is tagging parents as terrorists for going to school board meetings and either protesting or sharing their views about the upbringing of their children, I mean, it would be a very potent political argument against a candidate if in fact were true. So I sadly think it's clearly not a real issue. By all of the analysis I just presented, it's not in the memo, it's not the position of the Attorney General of the United States, it's been fact-checked by an independent source. But the only thing I can think of is that they think if they keep saying it, that somehow it will become true, like they keep saying, all Democrats are defunding the police, but that's just not true. So I sadly think, we're getting close to an election. This is about a desperate attempt to regain power so they can, proceed with agenda that I
Well,
frankly.
could I ask you, if I could ask you one other question, Mr. Cicilline, because I know you're a
Happy to.
student of this kind of political rhetoric. But look, there's a deadly serious issue here, which is real violence that is killing real people in churches, among African-American parishioners in South Carolina, among Jews in Pittsburgh, in the Hispanic community in El Paso, Texas. Across the country, nobody is safe from this, and it came right here on January 6th. Why would people want to be distracting us with these irrelevant issues at this point?
And because so many of our colleagues have remained silent and haven't even condemned the activities. Some have described them as just tourists visiting the Capitol. So I think that answers the question.
Gentleman's time has expired. Without objection, I'll enter into the record a March 15th, 2022 letter in support of H.R. 350, written by SPLC Action. And also, I want to enter into the record a USA Today article dated February 15th, 2022, that found that local school officials across the United States are being inundated with threats of violence and other hostile messages from anonymous harassers nationwide, fueled by anger over culture war issues. Reuters found 220 examples of such intimidation and examples. The FBI's Counterterrorism and Criminal Investigation Division created an Edu Officials tag to track cases that involve threats against school board administrators, board members, teachers, and staff, according to an email exchange between FBI officials attached to Jordan's letter. Nothing in the letter states that the tag will be used against parents who protest at school board meetings. This is the USA Today article. Nothing in the letter states that the tag will be used against parents who protest at school board meetings. A tag is a statistical tool used to track information for review, according to the FBI, which uses a wide array of tags to track cases of different types, such as human trafficking or drug trafficking. The FBI said in an emailed statement to USA Today that it must have information indicating the potential use of force or violence and a potential violation of federal law for a division to open an investigation. The FBI statement said that the agency, quote, has never been in the business of investigating parents who speak out against, or excuse me, let me say that again. The FBI statement said that the agency has, quote, never been in the business of investigating parents who speak out on policing speech at school board meetings, end quote. We are fully committed to preserving and protecting First Amendment rights, including freedom of speech, the statement said. The FBI's focus is on violence and
Mr.
threats
Chairman,
of violence
parliamentary
that
inquiry.
potentially violate federal law.
Is it appropriate on a unanimous consent request to read the full content of the item being submitted into the record? If it is, I object to that.
The chair will rule.
If that's the case, I have a point of order. I'd like to read the documents that I submitted earlier. If we're going to start reading them, Mr. Chairman, I would like to.
Point of order, it's too late.
It's never too late, sir. We haven't adjourned. We haven't adjourned. We haven't even voted on this yet.
Gentlemen, will suspend. Mr. Chairman. Because a number of members of both parties have to attend a signing ceremony at the White House shortly.
Mr. Chairman, it's our turn, though.
It's the signing ceremony for the arbitration bill on sexual assaults that we passed a few weeks ago. The markup stands in recess.
I'm shocked I wasn't invited to